It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of SPJMR Center for Wisdom and Leadership, or CWL. At CWL, we believe that true leadership transcends tactics and strategy. It is grounded in wisdom, self awareness, and purpose. Inspired by SPJMR's mission of value based growth, our work brings together ancient wisdom traditions from East and West with modern leadership practices. We draw from literature like Bhagavad Gita, Patanjali Yoga Sutra, Vedas, and including Sufi texts. So at we also host various events and also conducting various research programs currently going on. So today I welcome Professor Shilpa Pandit. She's a student of Indian sacred traditions and academically trained as a psychologist. Currently, she teaches psychology at Ahmedabad University. Prior to that, she has been involved in teaching, research, and social action over last 25 years. She's interested in rasa music, dance, emotions. She has worked with the domain of creativity. She has authored two books. The most recent title, Decolonizing Consciousness, Reclaiming the Indian Psychology of Well-being, focuses on Indic consciousness-based view of well-being. The second book is in a textbook of psychology that attempts to bring Indian psychology framework in Introduction to Psychology itself, an Introduction to Psychology, Global Outlook, Indian Perspectives. She currently working on two more books on trauma and healing in the context of law, and another book on bhakti, music, and Indian philosophy. So with this, I welcome Professor Shilpa Pandit and would request her to share her knowledge and wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very warm invitation and welcome. And it is my honor here to present this research work in the presence of great teachers and professors. So those whom I look up to. So thank you very much. I'll start sharing my screen. So basically, by the time the screen gets shared, I would like to share that my own study of this research area started with an empirical observation. So my view did not start from texts and theory, but it rather started from my own empirical observations, and then it moved to texts and theory. So there is a very famous statement in the Shaiva tradition, Nartaka Atma Ranga Antaratma. So the dancer is the self, and the platform, the seer is also the self. So this really inspired me, and so I started working on this idea of rasa. And amazingly, I'm just not able to complete my work for the last 25-30 years. I'm only doing this research, and so we will see how it has gone and enriched my life as well as, I hope, the life of others. So the flow of today's conversation is, why do we need to study Indian psychology of emotion? Particularly because the general understanding of Indian psychology is more of a Adi Shankara's Vedanta, from a Adi Shankara's Vedanta view, or a Yoga Sankhya view, where emotions are seen in a different way. Whereas while we come to the when we come to the 10th or the 11th century onwards, we suddenly find a flourishing of a particularly different view of Vedanta itself, starting from Sri Ramanuja on to the 16th century Chaitanya's Gaudiya Vaishnava traditions. So that's a different view of Vedanta and the Bheda Bheda doctrine that is discussed with great detail. So why study Indian psychology of emotion? Then rasa in the context of research. And if we have time, then I will delve into rasa and body, rasa and affect in Natya Shastra, then rasa and music, as well as rasa and bhakti. So Finally, actually, it should come as the alpha as well as the omega, rasa and existential meaning, because we see rasa across the Vedic corpus, as we will discuss. So, as I said, my research journey started with my own empirical observations and my personal interest in arts and aesthetics. And so, my question really was that they keep saying, people keep saying that music takes you near to God, or music makes you feel happy, and so on and so forth. So, my own question was, why and how do music and dance transform emotion into well-being? Because even in music and dance, particularly in dance, you see a visual depiction of agony, you see a visual depiction of horror, you see a visual depiction of pain and anguish, but still people feel a sense of validation. When they validation is now my post facto word, but they do come out feeling a little better, feeling better, or in a state of well-being. So I was primarily working with creativity and empathy, and with mixed methods approach. Although my whenever I have worked with creativity and empathy, my leaning has been towards qualitative methods. But yes, there are people who have used large sample surveys, etc., which most psychologists are trained in. So I'm basically abstracting three studies here, where I worked with musicians, dancers, meditators, philosophers, as well as some corporate recruiters, because some of the corporate recruiters, and this is 15, 20 years back, wanted to recruit young what is that called, young workforce which were creative. And this was like the beginning of the Bangalore being an IT hub and so on and so forth, or in the middle of it maybe. And people wanted to know, how can the best performing, masterful, creative employees join us? And that has been a problem with psychology, and particularly recruitments, where the focus is on field marks, etc. Later, I have developed this idea of rasa into leadership, but at a very initial stage, and I have not put it in the presentation here, but we can discuss about it. So I found in my review interviews with and also painters is also it's not written here, but I worked with painters as well. So basically, I got an initial understanding, a very basic, superficial understanding, that rasa is subjective as well as an intersubjective shared state. So there is a subjective phenomenal element to it, and equally so, there is a shared intersubjective dialogical element to it, particularly in the Indian music and dance traditions, where there is a possibility of spontaneity and a dialogue with the audience. And nowadays, of course, musicians, my musician friends and interlocutors said that nowadays with large, concerts, it doesn't happen. But typically and traditionally, in intimate gatherings of enlightened rasikas and the performer, there is a greater sense of a dialogue, and in that dialogue, the prop for that dialogue, or that intellectual aesthetic immersion, is the music, or is that particular musical or dance element. So this came to the second point, which is the idea of a rasanubhava. And rasanubhava is such a thick concept that it actually links the body, mind, affect, cognition, as well as the existential meaning of the self itself, which we will see, as you know, is referred in the Taittiriya Upanishad, the second chapter, the second Vali of the Taittiriya. So rasanubhava means but in the context of music and dance, my interlocutors told me that it is a conscious creation of an immersive, joyful engagement. So it is not, I mean, the people who perform have a special duty, so to say, a special mastery to consciously, dialogically create an immersive, aesthetic, joyful experience that, at its best, should fundamentally change the person's life, or reorient their life. So then I went and I talked with a whole lot of audiences. So I can see that, as a psychologist, I'm taught to be skeptical, right? So I could see that there was emotion, yes, why not? There was aesthetic enjoyment, yes, why not? There was affective, joy. There was a joy and a validation, yes, why not? But the fourth condition that was put for Rasanubhava, that it should fundamentally transform my view or reorient my view, was found rare. But whenever it was, people did remember it as those memory anchors that fundamentally changed their view in different ways. So that was something very important and interesting for me. So this is this generally the theory of rasa in the Indian culture. And then, of course, I published one paper on it, which talked about its comparison, a very initial paper on empathy and compassion. uh, Although empathy and compassion in the context of psychology, particularly in clinical and counseling psychology, is a very reductive, is a very limited, even though useful concept. So from my research moved from curiosity to textual and theoretical work, and it has continued in those loops. So I am still in that tala where I come to the sum, the first matra, and I go back again, and again I go to the khali, which is the place of emptiness in the Indian tala rhythms cycles, and then I go back to the first. So I have been doing this for the last 20-25 years. So there are some important terms for people who may not be aware of it, or the probably not this audience, but generally for audiences, there are some very important terms that we use, which is rasa bhava, and there is a lot of debate on bhava rasa distinction, etc., if at all or if not, and so on. Then there is a sthai bhava, there is anubhava, sanchari, and there is a vibhava. So this is basically the theory of emotion on which psychologists have written, including Schweder. Schweder, who's a cultural psychologist from Chicago, who has written it, and Professor Paranspe has referenced it. So this is basically a theory of emotion that comes in the Natya Shastra itself, which is talking about how there is a consistent emotion, there is a behavioral expression of that emotion, which is anubhava. There are sanchari bhavas, which is the concomitant emotions that go along with it. And then there is a vibhava, which is causative factors within oneself or in the environment. Right? So, as I mentioned, my methods were these, my participants were these, painters as well. And so I found three basic results, in terms of psychology. So one is this phenomenology of rasa, that people said that whenever something became very important, they not only were they engaged in their attentional deployment, or what cognitive psychologists say, but they had a sense of loss of time. They thought time passed by, or that the time stopped. Then they had this sense of loss of self consciousness. They also had an intensive awareness of the other, and there was an exploration of an uncensored self. So we tend to censor ourselves and present accordingly. So these were uncensored moments, and they felt that the intimacy of that kacheri, or that kacheri is called in South India, or that mahfil, allowed for that uncensoring. Then there was an intensity and continuity of that mood over time, which means that if they had a great concert, then they kept on remembering that, being in that mood for 2 days, 3 days, not only the performers, but sometimes even the listeners. For performers, it is commonsensical. If they would really would, I mean, it's not such a big deal. So many times there was a retrospective feeling of awe or goodness, even when they remembered that. And that seems to be a very kind of a universal point in rasa theory, because you see, even if in my current classes, Professor Rajan was asking, do you teach anything about Indian psychology? So even in my current classes, if I say, can you just close your eyes and evoke the sound of Lata Mangeshkar or Arijit, which is the current favorite, or Shreya Ghoshal, they are able to evoke that auditory imagery, and they feel good about it. A smile comes to their face. So that was the phenomenology of rasa. Then this new idea called manodharma. So this is something interesting about Indian traditions, because this rasa is very closely mapped with self and self-expression and self-awareness, that there is a margin for interpretive, spontaneous expression, and that intimate gathering of that mahfil or that kacheri, as we call it in South India, allowed for that uncensored exploration of the sound or the rhythm or the bandish without dishonoring it. And then, of course, I spoke about this dialogical element. Now, I worked with musicians, dancers, but I also worked with painters. Now, painters, I was really curious because in a performance space, there is an immediate synchronicity of mood. That's why you can explain a dialogue. You can say that I evoked this particular facial expression and the person responded. So there's a mirroring response to it. But why does that? Why do you say that painting is also part of the rasa theory? And so I was told by many of the painters that there is a dysynchronous or dyschronous dialogue that's but still happens in the some of the most important paintings. There is a process of dialogue that particularly happens, and the painting should be able to convey the emotion that the painter wanted. So now we have these 9 rasas and the 9 bhavas. And I think this is something that everybody knows about it. I would like to just say, as you go over them, that I was particularly interested in this discussion on the Mahabhava Maharasa concept. So there were at least 3 candidates for this Mahabhava Maharasa concept in the Indian philosophy. One, of course, is Shrungara, which is kind of a later development, I think, around 14th, 15th century. Shrungara is called the Rasaraj, or that the whole world is supposed to be immersed in Shrungara. So Bhoj was a great proponent of it, but quite later. And then, of course, you have Karuna, which I think Bhavbhuti said that Karuna, the whole world is filled with Karuna or compassion. And the third candidate, which I was also interested in, was Adbhuta. And there was some discussion in some references that Adbhuta could be a Maharasa because the whole world seems to be filled with a sense of astonishment and curiosity. So, sometime I thought I should do some work on, awe, particularly because it effaces your sense of self. Looking at the magnitude or the grandiosity of something, one tends to feel unthreatened yet very small. That seems to be the characteristic of awe. So I thought that that could be connected to intrinsic motivation, curiosity particularly. But curiosity is just like a small 5 rupees top up on this whole idea of awe as a postpaid. So we will come back to this again in an iterative loop. But in the initial phases, my own, it created a lot of questions to me and a lot of implications, which kind of gave me in the first iteration some more questions. So at that time, around 15 years back, around that, it was all cognition, cognition, and cognition. And so I started thinking, rethinking of my own learning and understanding, and saying that probably affect is fundamental to all of us. And then, of course, I looked at, say, when we look at Sachidananda, the idea of Sachidananda. At Sachidananda, also some historian friends of mine say that came later. In the Upanishadic text is Satyam Anantam, uh, you know, uh, as a description or a characterization of Brahman. But I started thinking of affect, and there are a lot of debates about the nature of Ananda. And Ananda is an affective term. It's a very famous Indian term which has gotten exported everywhere. So rather than looking at Sat and Chit, I was quite taken in by the notion of Ananda and what it is, and how is it read in yoga texts, or how is it read in Vedantic texts, etc., etc. Then, from a psychology point of view, of course, it presents a very good counter to the idea that emotion is situated in the brain, you know, somehow in some kind of brain functions. Because if consciousness itself is an emergent phenomena, according to physicalists, then obviously emotion is also something that one can work out just by wiring and rewiring. So this was like a good counter, at least to my mind. And so this was something that I tried to work on. That is affect ecological, dialogical, performative, in addition to being embodied sensual. So by sensual, I don't mean sexual always, because that's another kind of a automatic mapping that people make, but pure sound, pure notes, instrumental music, pure rhythms. There is some amazing an interesting intersection with the yoga step of pratyahara, when it comes to sensual aspects of the embodied consciousness. So that was the point about pure sound, pure movement, as in dance, and pure visuals. Can they transform the raw experience or the nature of embodied consciousness? Can they, because that's how people said, that's how people remembered it, and that's how very rarely some people said reoriented their life. Like a particular, Darbari Kannada changed their life, a particular Todi, they still remembered that Todi, they still remembered those auditory imagery. Yes, so which brings me to this, that all imagery, visual imagery, taste, gustatory imagery, touch imagery, the memory of a touch, etc., but particularly auditory and visual imagery, and how can, actually speaking, Indian psychology might be working at such subtle levels of awareness that our particular state of instrumentation, apart from the worldview, is actually not only reducing it, but actually distorting the knowledge that comes out of it. Like how the radio, if it's not properly tuned, instead of putting music, sends out static. So that was the kind of seed of thought, and which is why I again wanted to go in depth into this. Particularly then, after some time, I realized that I should look at the Kashmiri Shaiva uh, uh, texts or philosophers, because it was they, starting from Utpaladeva onwards, who looked at Vedanta as Advaya in a different sense of non-duality. And I'm still trying to work on it and trying to get some details on it. But I'm reading a bit more. Now, what were the applications? So there were several applications that we could develop out of it, particularly for if we wanted people to be creative. So, students, why are our students not creative? Why are our students performative in a very reductive sense? Why are our students running after marks? Why are our students not able to solve problems? They are, and there is Sternberg has talked about it, that, we have an excellent understanding of intelligence as abstract, rational, but we are not able to understand creative aspects of intelligence. And so that was one. Then there was some attempt that I tried to do for creating leaders who have a holistic view of, leadership, which was not about just managing emotions, which was not just about managing oneself and others, but which was in creativity. For example, people do so much work and they inspire others to do work, but then they become leaders without wanting to become leaders in a way. And there is a lot of joy in that leadership, which is not manufactured, which is not a manufactured, appraisal oriented joy. So these were the things. And now I will briefly discuss the emotion theory, criticizing it, to kind of, in another 5 minutes, to come back to the next loop, which I will focus on bhakti as a rasa. So generally, there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the mainstream emotion theory. Not only is it locked in the body, not only is it locked in the body, it's locked in the brain, primarily in the brain and the endocrine system. There are multiple dualisms and reductions in in psychology as such, the cognition, affect, behavior, trisection, then brain, mind, body problem, the mind body problem, the subject object, and so on and so forth. A lot of it has been written about as well. But among all of these aspects of the experience, there is largely a focus on cognition. And even though people are talking about affect now, particularly in the last 3 4 years, with the advent of AI, they are still not able to crack it. That is something that I understood when in my Fulbright experience. They are not able to understand or crack it, of affect and consciousness. They're not able to crack it. Then, of course, this is related to self identity and personality. There is a lot of discussion about self identity and personality and their definitions, etc. So, there is a whole lot of a silo on this. Um, and in the Indian context, clearly it is associated with the self, whether as an embodied self, as we see in bhakti, which is it where it is called as the deha tattva, or even in the discussions on transcending body awareness. So even when there is a discussion on transcending body awareness, there is a fundamental and immediate focus on the affect, the affective responses. And so whenever we say talk about Shat Sampat in Advaita also, or whenever we talk about emotions as Shadripus, so we are talking about emotion in a different worldview where we are looking at them as enemies, Shadripus. And I think many of the Indian psychologists themselves, psychologists in India, don't follow this, and they don't understand that there are multiple worldviews about affect and emotion, and we just need to kind of study them and engage with them. Then, largely in the mainstream emotion theory, there is still a strong influence of the Freudian approach, which not only sexualized emotion, completely reduced it to sexuality, but also pathologized most of it. So, but credit to the neo-Freudians, they still seem to have tried to move beyond the constraints of the initial template that kind of boxed it to them. But there are some interesting studies on awe, because awe, for example, as I said, I'm deeply interested in Adbhuta. So one of the Freudian psychologists told me, neo-Freudians, that awe is also associated with fear, which is true. But in the bhakti traditions, we see a reappraisal of that fear as sharanagati, which is a separate topic in itself. But largely, the point circling back is that there is an influence of the Freudian approach where emotions and affect are not only sexualized but pathologized. So, what about the rest of life? What about the rest of well-being? That seem to be a big gap then. Even now in positive psychology, we do have some references to creativity, but this Indic view of creativity and courage and all that feeds into their view of pluralistic theories. So this is an Indian theory which is independent of other influences and a very powerful way to look at life itself. So then another point which is difficult or sketchy, I wouldn't say completely missing, but sketchy in the mainstream theories is this affective transformation, this switch, this shift in a non-threatening manner. So we do go to a psychotherapist and we do a reappraisal of our views. Lazarus and Folkman have talked about it, coping theory, etc. But it can be threatening because somebody is pointing it out to you that you need to do this and you need to do that. Whereas this is a very non-threatening, enjoyable stimulus, but it is causing an emotional transformation. Now, someone might ask, a student might ask and say, oh, but there's a language that works and, contaminates the meaning making process. Because the whole idea here is, and that's why I'm so pleased that Professor Rajan is here, is on experience, the meaning of experience. But the whole fundamental idea in instrumental music is not the language, right? So there is something else going on here. One can say the moment cognition and language get mapped to each other very closely, then one can say that, it is the language which is causing this kind of an effective response. So if you're listening to Lata Mangeshkar and you know Hindi, yes, sure, why not? But if you're not listening, if you're listening to some Turkish language and still you're moved, or if you're listening to some instrumental music and you're moved, why did that happen? So that auditory, at the auditory non-verbal imagery level, there is something that is happening in the context of music, but largely in the context of beauty, in the context of a painting. Why should a painting, even an abstract painting, move us? That is something that we have not yet figured in psychology, in mainstream psychology. And that is something that probably rasa theory can, if someone decides to pick it up and do. Then, of course, there's a complexity of emotional vocabulary. I talked about it, the Bhava Rasa debate, the Rasa Ananda debate, the Brahmananda Rasa Ananda debate. So there are several debates which are, which are gems hidden, which you need to then think from a psychology perspective. See, yes, kyun bol rahe hain? Why are they talking like this? And then maybe, so there's a complexity of emotional vocabulary in not only in Sanskrit, but in all Indian languages, all of them. And that in itself is a something of a separate session, maybe not now. But yes, that was the problem with the Indian, with mainstream emotional theories. So what are the big theories in emotion? So first are psychophysiological theories, which were early theories that emphasize the connection between the body responses and emotions. So they basically fight and flight and freeze kind of theories, and psychology itself has gone beyond it now, but we tend to teach them as colonial subjects. Um, then we don't move beyond them, even in our teaching. Then, of course, there's a social constructionist view, such as Denzin, Gergen, Schroeder. They highlight the social cultural factors. Then there are cognitive appraisal theories, which Shastar, Lazarus, which I mentioned, Lazarus's theory of coping. They talk about a person's evaluation of it, and where they talk about a reappraisal of the same stimulus. Then, of course, there's a trending neurological perspectives, which particularly by Panksepp and Ledoux, which have talked about the brain's role. And Ledoux, by the way, in 1996, wrote a paper where he said that infants don't have emotions. And there's no proof for that infants have emotions. And then, of course, he was proven wrong, because from 2010 onwards, there were some series of papers which were published on infant consciousness, which showed that infants have complex emotions like teasing and joy and humor and amusement, etc. If someone wants a reference list, I can give it to them. Then, of course, there's a very strong tradition of evolutionary psychology, where we are animals before we are humans. And there are patterns of emotionality that we see, which are largely rooted in survival, reproductive success, fit, adaptive responses, etc. Paranspe wrote a paper in Psychological Studies where he first time talked about rasa theory as the Indian psychology of emotion. Now, the problem that currently even now persists, specifically even now, I mean, after 15, 20 years, is that these social constructions that we have received through our colonial experience conflict with the uh, worldviews or the emotional vocabularies or the meta theory that animate our emotional life. And that is what we see in our students. And that is what we see in our workforce. And that is what we see across the board. That is what we see even in among our teachers. And this has also been commented upon, particularly by Mishra and others, Professor Gupta, that this confusion, conflict And alienation is one of the biggest cognitive clutters that we have. It is a clutter. And then, second, of course, is that in education and in society and in academia, we have marginalized our indigenous concepts like Rasabhava. We talk about it when we perform or when we listen to music or dance or we socialize, but we do not allow them entry into our formal discourses. Formal discourses. So then, of course, there's a mimicking of the imposed models. Then one of the most interesting thing about an Indian theory of emotion, which I have written elsewhere, is that our the idea of emotion in the Indian context is based on the directionality of that emotion, which means that as in case of disgust, so disgust is called vibhatsa, jugupsa, disgust. So when this disgust is directed towards the world and away from the world towards a spiritual practice, then it's a very positive emotion. And that's what many sannyasis would say, that aapko virakti aa gayi, right? So disgust is as an emotion in Indian, as an emotion in psychology and used in English has no direction. But vibhatsa has a directionality. So if the directionality is towards adhyatma or spirituality, then it's a very positive emotion. But when the directionality is towards something else, then it's a negative emotion. A case and example is Sri Krishna, very famous example, Bhagavad Gita. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna says that I cannot do this war, right? So he directed him towards the whole knowledge, etc., and then continued with the war, right? So now, because in the mainstream psychology, you have a very dumb binary called positive and negative emotions, and some emotions are on absolute terms, not even in terms of a directional vector, placed as positive, and some are placed as negative. You have a complete confusion because there is a loss of meaning there. Then, of course, rasa as a case. And from here onwards, I will talk about the recent research, which is basically focusing only on embodied consciousness. I'm not getting into the debates of how to transcend body awareness, etc. As a woman, born in the woman's body, a consciousness, I'm perfectly fine with with the theory of embodied consciousness. And in 2009, for example, when Paranspe wrote this paper on rasa theory as an Indian psychology of emotion, he did not distinguish between embodied and transcendental consciousness, although this binary also we have received. It's a received binary. And this particularly I am not also interested to look at, because currently embodiment, disembodied Zoom learning, and so on are very important topics when we look at consciousness and machine cognition, for example. So, as a woman, born in a body of a woman, I'm okay with the theory of embodied consciousness, and as a psychologist, I'm interested to look at an embodied consciousness theory, because for all practical purposes, we are living in in a world with an embodied consciousness, and also we are changing the world, playing in the world as we are living. And with the current discussions on machine cognition, I think we should focus more attention on embodied consciousness as an applied Indian psychology. So Paranspe gave an example of intentional role play within bhakti, and that kind of triggered my view on bhakti traditions, because till then I was with the musicians and dancers and painters and so on. So bhakti, people have looked at it from an anthropological point of view. A lot of religious studies scholars, etc., have looked at bhakti, and they have written some very interesting books. In fact, Divine Passions was the first one that I read. Then I ended up reading Madness of Saints by June McDaniel. She's written a whole lot of other things as well. And then, of course, Linda Hess, very famous. And they have tried to look at it. Now, the problem with us is the anthropological approach starts very well, and it does use methods which we can use in psychology. It starts very well, but it doesn't circle back to universal ideas which arise from an Indian psychology perspective. It ends up getting stuck in the quagmire of cultural relativism. That's it. It cannot take it to the next level where we identify something which is a unique contribution, which is an interesting, important, and and people would appreciate that. We are not able to do that. So now comes this bhakti rasa, and then I, to start from where bhakti as a rasa came in. So we see that rasa occurs across the Vedic corpus, but it has several meanings. For example, it has a meaning of an offering, it has a meaning of a relish or a delight, it has also a meaning of a flow. So Paniniya's Dhatu Patha will talk about rasa as a flow. But the fundamental foundational text that really connects it to emotion is Taittiriya Upanishad. In the second Valli, we see Raso Vaisaha. So Raso Vaisaha has been interpreted by the great masters, etc., etc. And Shankaracharya himself, Adi Shankaracharya himself, connects it to Ananda. And several other masters have also connected to Ananda, because the next subsequent Richa will talk about Ananda. So Taittiriya itself is called as the Ananda Mimamsa, which means the study of well-being or happiness. Better than happiness, I think well-being or contentment or Ananda. Then, of course, there is a distinction now of rasa in Natya. In Natya Shastra, rasa is in a particular performative space. And music and all music, theater, dance, etc., is discussed in the Natya Shastra context in a particular performative sense. And they were right, my interlocutors, who said that when I am performing, my intention is not to enjoy the rasa. My intention is to share it with them enough that they enjoy it more. So, because Abhinav Gupta, who was a great scholar and a Kashmiri Shaiv master, he said that the rasa is not for the performer. And so, how do you unpack that? So, many of my interlocutors mentioned that my focus is not so much on my enjoyment, but to see that the other enjoys and understands and relishes the meaning of what I am trying to present, has a meaningful experience. Then I also found that there is a idea of rasa in the body itself, and this we see in Ayurvedic texts, where rasa is one of the dhatus, but it is one of the most important ones, because Ayurvedic texts say that it is only due to rasa that the mother feeds her child. So it is a more complex kind of an understanding and alchemical. I don't want to get into popular psychology, but a notion of an alchemy is inherent in the notion of rasa. Or if we don't want to use the word alchemy, then the notion of transformation. So the mother feeds the child milk, and that is because of that transformation from blood to milk. Okay. And then, of course, Ayurveda also has a theory of emotions. And there are several Ayurvedic texts on that called Vegas, which are involuntary emotions or drives, what we call in psychology as drives. Then finally, we come to Acharya Abhinav Gupta's commentary. And Acharya Abhinav Gupta's commentary is the foundational commentary on rasa nishpatti, which is the experience of rasa. Why does rasa experience happen? There was 1,000-year debate on this, and everybody argued, everybody discussed. So first off, Acharya Abhinav Gupta was a Kashmir Shaiva master, and he belonged to a tradition of Kashmir Shaiva great masters who were basically integrators of several traditions. And they also are non-dualists, but they have fundamentally revised their notion of um, samvit. And the word that they would use is samvit, which is consciousness, and that they fundamentally re-understood the engagement with the world as real and as a play. Very briefly. So Acharya Abhinav Gupta first wrote a thesis on Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka, and then he interpreted the Natya Shastra. That's a very powerful moment, I think, in the Indian psychology of emotion, because he gave a psychological theory of why rasa nishpatti happens. So we'll spend 2, 3, 5 minutes on this, because this is really the core of psychology. So the stage is a projection in a way of the inner and the outer. And uh, so the stage is projecting, and that's very important. Because if you recall, I said that there are other worldviews, which many psychologists sometimes say that we have no good view about emotion because, we look at emotions as shadripus. So it is true that in the yogic texts, or in the Advaita Vedanta kind of texts, we think of emotions as something to be controlled or to be seen as enemies. Shadripu, 6 enemies, but they are particular negative emotions, which are, for which also there is a lot of unpacking that needs to be done, which many people may not do. So, Kama, Krodha, Mada, Moha, Lobha, Matsara. So these are Shadripus. So Kama particularly is seen as an emotion, and therefore it is seen as a sexuality and is seen as a negative emotion, etc., etc. So this idea of rasa looks at emotion as an upaya. Now, how do emotions become upaya? How does samsara, which brings these shadripus to us and bind us, so to say, can be transformed? That's a very good question. Now, what to do? Because we are living in an embodied consciousness, and there are all kinds of desires, let's say for potato chips or pizzas or whatever else there is. Um, and or there is a desire for a position, or there is a desire to fame or whatever. So the idea of a stage as a projection is very important, because it brings two contradictory processes that we see in empathy as well. That it allows you to view something distanced from you, and yet you are engaged in it in an immersive format. And that is a point that Acharya Abhinav Gupta did in his commentary on Natya Shastra, Abhinav Bharati, right? So, Nartaka Atma, Ranga Antaratma. So, this stage, Ranga, and the Nartaka is the person who's dancing. Now comes a very important psychological point. Transformation can happen when you're able to see. But emotion can be seen either on an internal stage, as what we try to do in Sakshi Bhava, or easier if we see it outside. So the idea here is that emotion is elaborated by the performers, by the dancers, by the musicians, and that emotion is to be revised and elaborated again and again. That process Abhinav Gupta Acharya calls as charvana. Charvana means uh, regurgitation, probably. And so this paradoxical connection, immersive connection, and yet a safe distance allows for that emotion to be experienced completely. And that tanmayata, tallinata, makes a Sahridaya. Sahridaya is a term that we use. Sahridaya means my heart is your heart. And that is what that stage as a performance space does to the emotion. So my heart is your heart. And in that way, the emotion is experienced. And then Abhinav Gupta says, Acharya, that the person arrives at Vishranti. Vishranti means that the person recognizes it as part of their self, the possibilities of their self, and therefore arise at a empathy, compassion kind of a word in English that, yeah, that can happen. Yes, that happened. So, and I asked this question to a lot of people that, if something happened, if some woman was being molested in their real life, if I was being molested, I would not be able to watch that. Forget about it. But Sita is being hijacked, and people are able to watch it. And they are able to watch it and still not, hate that Ravana, or, decide to hurt him or harm him, the character of the Ravana, right? So there's an extraordinarily complex psychological maneuvering that's happening when the stage is being used as a projection, and that's precisely what Abhinav Guptacharya used. Now, the stage can be internal as well as external, or the world itself is a stage, right? So this engaged distance in seeing is allowed in a non-threatening, non-psychotherapy context, and not even a couch context like Freudians, but I'm able to see it not only I, but as a group, Sadrush Karana, the terms that have been used by Abhinav Guptacharya, Sadrush Karana and Sadharani Karana. So Sadharana means not common, but universal, Sadharana, right? So first you express that emotion that is hidden in that element or that bandesh or that musical piece or dance piece, and then you elaborate on it, and then you elaborate on it, and it allows that elaboration in a shared context, allows for it to become sadharana. Sadharana is not common. Sadharana, which means that all are holding it, that emotion. And so, therefore, there is a kind of a group or a social awareness or understanding of that emotion. Right? In that Sadharanikarana, Sadrishkarana, Sadharanikarana, Charvana, Sahridaya, Tanmaya, Sadrishkarana, Sadharanikarana processes that raw emotion, like somebody molesting a woman, gets transformed into a rasa. What is that rasa? Shoka, Karuna, right? Shoka Karuna. So it is not a blaming emotion. It is not an emotion which is censored. It is experienced fully, but it is experienced with that self awareness that, yes, that's true. That's true. Right? Now, this is even different than mindfulness. A lot of my students ask about it, and we can go into it if that is required. Now comes bhakti. And as I keep mentioning Paranspe's paper, because Paranspe in that 2009 paper said that using reading bhakti texts, he found bhakti as a rasa and what is called as an intentional role play that the Gaudiya Vaishnavas took. That, I think, is a one step forward from the Natya rasa that Abhinav Gupta talked about. Because what is that bhakti as a rasa? Which means a lifelong intentional role play. And that connects us to well being like nothing else at an embodied level. So I do not, if a woman is born in a woman's body, consciousness takes a woman's body, or consciousness takes an animal body, or consciousness takes all kinds of bodies, right? So I do not need to worry now to transcend my body awareness and to continuously stay in a state of jnana, which is precisely the point that Vallabhacharya mentions that the problem with Sankhya is that if the sattva is to be cultivate it so that it reflects the nature of knowledge, then I constantly need to worry to be sattvika, right? So now I'm coming to Bhakti Rasa, and I'm particularly starting from Gaudiya Vaishnavas and the intentional role play idea of Gaudiyas, which is, I think, is just extraordinary. And there have been several religious studies scholars who have written about it, and we have in Indian psychology, or psychologists in India have not read it and applied their mind. But even in English, people have written about it. So Gaudiyas, this is a later one, so we'll regress back in time, 16th century from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So the fundamental idea here was, even though bhakti as a rasa was talked by Upadeva in 13th century, uh, and there are some debates in the religious studies, sector, that who first talked about bhakti as a rasa, etc. But we'll not get hijacked into it. Even though bhakti as a rasa first was taught by Vopadeva in 13th century, I am focusing here on human body as the epicenter of bhakti rasa. So Jiva Goswami himself and Rupa Goswami, the six Goswamis of Vrindavan, are the ones who wrote and established uh, framework, the framework of Gaudiya and Baul Bhakti. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself wrote just the Shikshashtakam, but the six Goswamis wrote a lot of these texts to establish their point of view. In these texts, we see the human body as the epicenter of bhakti. And not only is that, but we also see the divine bodies as well as real bodies called vigrahas, or what we call in English as deities, and are real bodies. So psychologists are going to get totally, what is it called? If you pardon my language, freaked out if they'll see this, right? Because the worldview is that worldview of sentience or consciousness itself is so in a particular way. So not only are the human bodies real and at the epicenter of bhakti, but there are divine bodies everywhere. And body itself, similar to what we see in the three ideas of the bodies, like the sthula sukshma, karana sharira context that we see in the Vedanta. Here, the idea of body is even more radical, because the bodies themselves can be the mantra as a body, the dhama, vajradham, vrajadhamam as a body, all the kshetras as the bodies, and so on and so forth. And there is this hierarchy of bodies, and all of them are aligned in a framework, and all of them are connected to each other with or without matter. So a body can be held without a material body, right? So that particularly ties up the bhaktas universe, so to say, and their relationship to the divine body. So the divine body with the prana pratishtha and so on and so forth, which we do, is real. And therefore, we see so many of these social psychological processes in the Indian context, which seem very irrational, but which are very real and rational according to the Indians, which is, whenever there's a marriage, you go to the deity's temple and offer the invitation to the deity, right? You feel the presence of the deity and so on and so forth. Or some such extraordinary ideas and belief systems that we have. And these bodies are hierarchically organized, and this all universe is real and an embodied universe. In this embodied universe, multiple embodiments in multiple worlds, there is an intentional role play. And that is something unique, because each one of us, if we are Indians or socialized into an Indian psychology, we will have a particularly personal relationship with the divine, spiritual divine, and that could be like a brother or a sister or mother or a friend or so on and so forth. So in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Rupa Goswami mentions these relationalities, and he uses the rasa theory framework, and Shanta rasa is at the lowest level, because he says that in the face of this charming, bewitching Krishna, how can you remain Shanta? How is that even possible? And so on. And Shringara, he mentions it at the top. Shringara rasa. So there are these rasas which he particularly adds as relational rasas for an intentional role play throughout the life, throughout the lifetime. And people take these intentional role plays throughout the lifetimes, and they do not have to transcend their bodies at all. Uh, then, of course, intentional role play is also a more advanced version of bhakti that he talks about, which is called as the Raga Anuga Bhakti. So, first is the Vaidhi Bhakti, which is, a typical social form of bhakti, a more traditional ritual form of bhakti. Both have rituals, I should not say that, but Raga Anuga Bhakti involves finding a mental, meditative relationship with the divine, using metaphors, using imagery, using imagery just like how we see in rasa theory. And this Raga Anuga Bhakti allows for an intentional role play and a life in the world where everything is accepted and yet everything is transcendent, right? There is also Manjari Bhav. So here we have these four levels of bhakti, that, four ideas of bhakti. I shouldn't say levels. So we see that in Advaita Vedanta, particularly, you talk about Sayujya, which means the merging or the union of the Jiva Shiva, which always was, which never was separate. Here they are like, okay, let me be separate and let me enjoy. And here Sarupya, so let me be one form of the the your divine play. So this is one particular idea which is particularly embodied, and it's not at all one worrying about transcending the body, etc., but living life as it is, as it comes to you, in the way it comes to you. Okay, so the next one, I think I will go through this very fast. So this is Vallabha. So we are going back about 2 centuries, Vallabhacharya Shuddhadvaita. And here I would like to just focus particularly on the interesting contribution, at least to me it is, which is Niyama and Bhakti Sadhana. So in these, the Goswamis, what they do is that, what they have done, which makes sense to us now, is that they have tied the full life cycle or the day of the deity with music and specific ragas. So you might recognize this as Haveli Sangeet. So one of the things that the Goswamis, Mahaprabhu Vallabhacharya as well as the later Goswamis did, is that they got the deity in a home, because the deity is like us. Of course, a more honored self, a more honored aspect of ourself, but it is like us. So they call the deities into their homes, and they created a treasure of songs, ragas, musical instruments, and they use music for every aspect of the day of the deity. So, for example, if the deity has to be woken up, then there's a song for the deity in Bhairav. If the deity has to go to play, then there's a song for deity to go and play. If this deity has to be fed, then there's a song before you put the Naivedyam. If the deity has to be coming back home after bringing all the cows, then there is a song for that. So the Haveli Sangeet, and the extraordinary idea here is that the deity is a owner of the house, and the whole house runs according to the niyama of the deity, and everything has to be sung because the deity has to be pleased. So everything now has to be done for the deity. So this is an earlier kind of a point that I am saying, and this was then consolidated by the Gaudiya traditions. So we see this here, particularly Atma Nivedana. I'm very interested in Atma Nivedana. So because, and I mentioned about music and collective worship, because in the 13th century, 1 century back, we see Jnaneshwara, and this is in Pune that what is happening here. You see Jnaneshwara, where you see this Natha Siddha tradition or the Kashmir Shaiva tradition already intersecting with bhakti in his two texts, Jnaneshwari and Amrutanubhava. So there's a lot of debate among Marathi scholars, etc., that why did Jnaneshwara, who was a Nath, write a commentary on Bhagavad Gita, which is a Vaishnava text. And there are lots of debates about Shaiva Vaishnava, and that Bhagavata became very important, and maybe therefore he did it, or did he do it as a strategy, or because he wanted to attract followers? I don't know. I have no opinions on that because I'm not a political scientist. What I find is that he defines bhakti even closer to the non-dualistic sense, because he defines bhakti as Swarupa Priti. Swarupa in his Amruta Anubhava text is that full Samvit, which is Shiva Shakti Aikya, which is coming from the Kashmir Shaiva traditions. All the vocabulary of the Gnaneshwari is non-dualistic. All the vocabulary of the Gnaneshwari is filled with the vocabulary of Shaiva traditions, Kashmir Shaiva traditions. He does not agree with Advaita Vedanta. So the point here is he looks at bhakti as Swarupa Priti, and he says everything is Swarupa, and in doing bhakti, in loving others, I am loving myself. And it is akrutrim, or non-artificial, precisely because that's all I am. I am loving my own self, my true self, my true self. So, and he also defined bhakti as Shantarasa. So, in Gaudiya tradition, you see bhakti as Shrungara. In Gnaneshwara, you see bhakti as Shanta. And there's some very interesting research on Laya. You know how people immerse themselves sometimes and lose themselves. So, I'm coming back, circling back to the point that I started when I talked to people, and they said that, sometimes you lose a sense of self, or you lose a sense of time, and that is very good, and that is well-being, and that concept is what we see as laya. So there is a laya, and this laya is different than the idea of samadhi, or the idea of turiya, or the idea, or some connection with the idea of nirodha. There are several texts written on it, but this laya can occur momentarily. It doesn't need to be like a process of dhyana where I'm sitting like this and so on and so forth. And whenever this laya occurs, depending on the person's immersion, that laya is very close to the rasanubhava experience. And then the laya is even deeper than rasanubhava, and that closely connects to the idea of consciousness. In the recent time, there is non-dual awareness. There's some research on non-dual awareness by people, but very difficult to do it in the brain studies. In the studies of the brains, they have coined, not for laya, they have coined a term called non-representational reflexivity, which means that, and I'm going to stop at this point, which means that which means that something is happening to the brain while the person is in laya, which is not linguistic or even based on imagery. This is the reason why people would come out of samadhi with the same brain and the body, and they might have some time before they can remember who they are, but still it would start functioning again. So this is non-representational reflexivity on which a lot of research is going on currently. So with this, I'm going to stop my uh, presentation. There is one more part of it, which I think basically it has a lot of implications on theory building, new theory building, then a new understanding of roles, then an idea about curriculum development. I think we can do a bit of curriculum development on this. Then, of course, practice and application. So, rasa, Krishna is Krishna, Vishnu, whoever, is the ultimate rasika. So, the ability to enjoy while leading is something that can be done. And a creative person as a leader ultimately is something that we can look at. And of course, I talked about Sadrishkarana and Sadharanikarana as fundamental ways in which people can receive insight without being forced to go to a psychotherapist. So, with this, I'm stopping here. I'm very happy to take any questions for the next 10 minutes. Although I must say that I have to close at 2:30 because I have a flight to catch.
So, okay, quickly, if you can have some questions, if there are any questions, then the floor is open.
Yeah. Anyone?
Yes. So,
Ma'am, namaste. I would
Namaste.
like
Who
to
is
ask you-
that?
I'm Nischala, and
Okay. Yeah,
uh,
Nishchala. Yeah,
yeah.
please.
I have a question regarding the prospects. Like if somebody wants to continue further research in this area, especially
Yeah.
about psychology,
Yeah.
in rasa theory and in Sahitya in general,
Yeah.
applications of Alankara Shastra and the rasa from there,
Yeah.
then how would you suggest, like, what is the way forward? What are the constructs that we can look at?
Right. So so you are interested in Sahitya or you are interested in psychology?
Both as an interface, like it's a connection between the two is what I'm trying to look at. So psychology and emotions and rasa theory, and what happens with Alankara Shastra also, that also the different
Uh-huh.
ways in which the emotions are raised
Right.
within
Right. So,
mind.
currently the way we are in a very dumb society, it is, and with the kind of AI and the kind of internet, Insta, etc., we're becoming dumber and dumber. So I think it is important to start with very basic points and then go into the depth of it. What we start with, I think that the way I would like to start is to start with a empirical question and start with an empirical question. Now, there are contexts in which we can use it separately. For example, in the context of education, if I were to use this, I would like to see how can we use rasa theory, the basics of rasa theory, to create a creative classroom. And how do I find out from rasa theory, how do I assess creativity? This is one of the biggest problems. We can generate marks and we can now find assignments which AI can do and plagiarism doesn't catch. So that's perfect. Nothing. So rasa theory involves an immersion into the idea and the elaboration of that idea, and then a consolidation and the presentation of it. So that we are not ready to do now. So can you find out some ways in which, in the context of education and in the context of, let's say, higher education, so you'll have to really narrow down not on the concept but narrow down on the context. So we need to narrow down whenever we are doing PhDs, but what are we narrowing down is the question. Are we
Hmm.
narrowing down the person to the brain, or are we narrowing down to the context? Because humans are context specific people, creatures. So it is better idea to narrow down the context rather than narrowing down the person or the experience, right? So you must narrow it down and not talk in absolutes. Even within Alankar Shastra, even within Rasa theory, even within Bhakti, there are very, very specific contexts in which there is a very, very specific solution. That is where the application will come in. Hmm. So,
Thank you,
so
ma'am.
whatever knowledge that you have currently, that's perfect, to good to go, better than ChatGPT. You start with an empirical question and then apply your earlier held knowledge and narrow down the context where it is applicable rather than narrowing down the person.
Okay.
Okay?
That's
Yeah.
very nice. Nice
Thank you.
suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Professor Rajan Gupta, maybe you can go ahead with your questions.
It's a way I'm experiencing goosebumps.
Thank you. Thank you. You are my teacher.
How do I put it? I'm feeling so emotional because, Shilpa, this is the most intricate but precise discourse where, based on an experience which all of us have,
Yeah.
you have created such a intricate tapestry with, interlocking the Western and the Indian
Hmm.
without losing, actually highlighting the value add by Indian wisdom.
Thank you so
And
much.
I can clearly see that this is clearly 25 years of research.
What to
It's
do?
so visible in your 1 hour presentation. I can
समझ
see
नहीं
it
आ रहा था.
as a presentation of a whole treatise on this subject, and so treatise of, as some people call it. So, and I also see it as a large research program
Yeah.
in this domain.
Yes.
It's not about research projects, it's a research program. And I hope you kind of, you are able to get that kind of a financial support from ICSSR and AICTE. I hope you will try for it, and because there are special categories of research program funding.
Yeah.
And I, you know, purely as a management scholar, OB management scholar,
Ji.
I thought, there could be a paper, and Ramya is here. I'm so glad. I wrote 30 years ago, I wrote a small paper. Is there a place for the sacred in organizations? And I thought there is a very beautiful possibility. Is there a place for rasa in organizations? And I was thinking of one of my friends who's been a very successful leader.
Huh.
And when he describes his town hall meetings,
Huh.
his town hall meetings were almost like a beautiful musical performance,
Huh.
engaging his managers and himself, his employees and himself,
Yeah.
and how this had beautiful, large impact. So I think leadership is also can performed with rasa involved,
Yes.
and
Yes,
there
sir.
can be a lot of applications. But anyway, I think Ramya wanted to say something. I'm keen to hear what she has to say, but this is wonderful, and I hope you really are getting, because this is not something you can do alone in a lifetime.
No, 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 not at all.
So you
Yeah.
need to have a whole team of people working on it. I hope some of the people who have listened to you today
Yeah.
will be glad to engage with you and establish collaborative work. And now I leave it to Ramya to add.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, what you have said is so true. All of us need to work in a team, and we really need to do some very interesting work on it. And I really thank you for this Ashirwad. Thank you so much.
Wish you
Thank
all
you.
the best.
Thank you.
Yes, Professor Ramya. Yeah.
After whatever sir has said, I don't have much to say, except that I am very much in awe of your presentation today. It was a performance, and we are still in that laya of it. So, still choking and trying to say something. It has been fundamentally transformative in some way. Deep down, we have been thinking with these frames of decolonizing management knowledge, and trying to do something in the margins. But all our grooming and training has been so deeply entrenched in that one way of thinking with the Western, universal paradigms
Yeah.
that the way you have so beautifully articulated it in the same in the English language, but to make so much sense. And many of us in our private lives, we all go to music concerts, we enjoy
Yes.
dance performances, so we are able to so much connect with what you're saying. It really brought tears to my eyes that you articulated it so beautifully and gave us some handle to move forward. One question which I had was
Yes.
about sculpture. I mean, it's so interesting.
Ah,
I mean, it's a coincidence that your name is also Shilpa, so I was about to
yes.
ask about Shilpa Shastra.
Yeah.
Have you looked at rasa in connection with sculpture per se? Because I was trying to look at no knowledge representation in sculpture itself, embodied in that embodied form rather than in a
Yeah. Yeah.
textual form.
Yeah.
And no, what can and there's some research that's happening on sculpture also. So how is
Mm.
that research represented, and how is that knowledge development happening? And even many of the dancers, they take cue from the sculptures,
Karanas. Yeah. Yeah.
and then they
Padma
create
Subramanian.
the they take create the performances, and the movement is also represented in the sculptures with the
Yeah.
four hands and all of that.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So at some point of time, I try to look at the mindfulness of the sculpture. The sculpture is, according to sculpture, the only thing that I've very little that I've read, because I've been working on mainstream international business research and quantitative stuff. But whatever little I understood is that it is supposed to put the viewer of the sculpture also in a mode of contemplation,
Yeah.
and the sculpture itself, or the deity, particularly sculptures of the deities themselves are have that expression of contemplation, and the sculptor also got into a mode of contemplation while making it. So all these
Yeah.
three entities get connected in some way. So I want your guidance to move forward on that, because I think mindfulness literature is very limiting me.
Yeah.
I'm stuck with that paper.
Yeah.
So maybe if I can reach out to you after this, if you can help me and guide me on that one to move forward. I think
Yeah.
definitely rasa theory is intrinsic to this entire thing, and that has been a big miss, I think, on my
Yeah.
part. So thank you so much for introducing the topic to us.
Oh, no, thank you so much. So first off, I tried to understand, because I used to stay in Tamil Nadu. I tried to understand the tradition of sculpting, particularly those karanas which are on the
Hmm,
temples
hmm.
which dancers go
Yeah.
and see, and so on. But there are people, great scholars there, who would be able to, I can connect you with them. The second thing that you mentioned is more psychological and important to me, is that the person who was in that state of mind created that
Hmm.
particular form, and that particular form now should generate the same state of mind into the other person who watches it. So that is a very subtle idea. And if you see in Tamil Nadu, they will say a lot of things about it. It's part of their mindset. That psychological process, we can do a separate research, because that is psychological.
Hmm, hmm.
uh, we should be able to do research on that. Not many papers on it, very fundamental basic papers on rasa theory, very difficult to find papers, very difficult to find scholars who are doing work on it, no. So we should do it. I'll be happy to connect with you.
Thank you, ma'am. I
Thank
mean,
you.
even the stories are very interesting. Like, in certain temples, there'll be a myth or legend
Yeah,
about how the
Kshetra Purana. Yeah,
sculpture was
Kshetra
created.
Purana. Yeah,
So
yeah,
a bunch of people came, they created, then they disappeared or they merged
yeah.
into the deity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mostly these kind of stories. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's yeah, I'll definitely connect it. But thank you so much, and
Thank you.
really
Thank you
in
very much.
awe, and very much my gratitude and pronouns for this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, thank you, everyone. Ma'am, you have shared a wonderful knowledge with us today, and I'm really delighted. I could connect on many levels, but yeah, there is
Yeah.
limited time. So, especially, I enjoyed the bhakti part because
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
have
I knew
a
that.
my mother is a bhakta, so I could understand a lot of things what you were
Yeah.
saying and connect to that.
Yeah.
And I really thank all the participants for their support and asking the questions. So this will be updated in our YouTube channel. So you'll get the
Okay.
recordings also if you want to refer to it again.
Yeah.
And we'll come up with next CWL uh, presentation and we'll inform. Okay. So thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Thank you, Professor.